Every parent's worst nightmare became Margaret Whitmore's daily reality when her 8-year-old son Thomas could no longer feel his legs. The wealthy widow had spent every dollar she could spare bringing doctors from the big cities. But each one left with the same heartbreaking words: her boy would never walk again. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, people whispered about a wild man living up in the mountains. They called him dangerous and unpredictable, but some said he had healing hands that could work miracles. With nothing left to lose, Margaret made the difficult journey up the mountain to find this mysterious hermit. She had no idea that this rough, untamed stranger would soon change her family's life forever. What could a mountain man do that trained doctors couldn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore stood at the window of her grand Victorian home, watching the dust settle on Main Street as another day began in Cedar Ridge. Her fingers unconsciously twisted the gold wedding band that still adorned her left hand, a habit she'd developed in the 2 years since her husband Robert's passing. The ring caught the morning light, reminding her of brighter days when laughter filled these rooms and hope seemed as endless as the Colorado sky. The sound of wheels against hardwood floors drew her attention back to the present. Thomas maneuvered his chair with the determination that had always marked his character, even before the accident. His sandy hair fell across his forehead as he concentrated on navigating around the furniture that had once been chosen for beauty rather than accessibility. "Morning, Mama," he said, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness she'd come to recognize. At 8 years old, her son had learned to mask his pain better than most adults. "Good morning, sweetheart." Margaret knelt beside his chair, smoothing his hair with gentle fingers. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," came the automatic response, though the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. Thomas had been having the dream again. The one where he was running through the meadow behind their house, chasing fireflies as he had that summer evening 6 months ago. The accident replayed in Margaret's mind daily, each detail etched with painful clarity. Thomas had been riding Copper, the gentle mare Robert had bought for his son's 7th birthday. The horse had never spooked before, never shown anything but the mildest temperament. But something had startled her that evening. A snake, they later discovered, and Copper had reared with unusual violence. Thomas had been thrown backward, landing with a sickening thud against the wooden fence post that marked their property line. Dr. Henley had been the first to examine Thomas, his weathered hands gentle, but his prognosis devastating. "I'm sorry. Margaret, the damage to his spine is extensive. We need to get him to specialists in Denver immediately." The journey to Denver had been the longest of Margaret's life. 3 different doctors, each with impressive credentials and kind eyes, had delivered variations of the same verdict. The boy's spinal cord had been severely damaged. While he retained some sensation in his upper legs, the likelihood of him ever walking again was virtually non-existent. Mrs. Whitmore, the most renowned specialist, had said, his voice heavy with professional sympathy, "I understand this is difficult to accept, but you need to prepare for the reality that Thomas will require a wheelchair for the rest of his life. With proper care and adaptation, he can still live a meaningful existence." Meaningful existence. The words had echoed in Margaret's mind for months. What kind of meaningful existence could an 8-year-old boy have when his dreams of running, playing, exploring the world on his own 2 feet had been shattered in an instant? She had spent nearly every penny of Robert's life insurance money on treatments, consultations, and experimental therapies. Each new doctor represented another flicker of hope, another possibility that someone, somewhere, might have an answer the others had missed. But hope was an expensive commodity, and Margaret's financial resources were dwindling as quickly as her optimism. The people of Cedar Ridge had been kind, of course. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought fresh bread twice a week and always lingered to chat with Thomas about his schoolwork. Sheriff Morrison made a point of stopping by regularly, sharing tales of his younger days that never failed to make the boy smile. Even stern old Mr. Jenkins at the general store had taken to setting aside the best penny candy for Thomas, though he gruffly claimed it was just good business sense. But kindness, Margaret had learned, couldn't heal a broken spine any more than money could buy back lost mobility. The town's sympathy was genuine, but it came with an undercurrent of resignation that she found increasingly difficult to bear. People spoke in hushed tones about accepting God's will and making the best of a difficult situation. Their words were meant to comfort, but they felt like small deaths to Margaret's stubborn refusal to surrender hope. It was Mrs. Patterson who first mentioned the mountain man, though she'd immediately regretted her words. "Oh, Margaret, I shouldn't have said anything," the elderly woman had whispered, glancing around as if the very mention might summon some dark presence. "He's not the sort of person decent folks associate with." But the seed had been planted. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself listening more carefully to the conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the mercantile or the church social hall. Fragments of whispered stories began to form a picture of a man living alone in the high country, someone the locals called Bear McKinnon, though none seemed to know his real first name. The stories varied wildly in their details. Some claimed he was a deserter from the war. Others insisted he was a former doctor who'd lost his mind after a terrible tragedy. A few of the older women crossed themselves when his name was mentioned, muttering about ungodly practices and deals with dark forces. But buried within the superstition and fear, Margaret began to hear other rumors, accounts of broken bones mysteriously healed, of livestock saved from diseases that should have been fatal, of remedies that worked when conventional medicine failed. Dr. Henley had been adamant in his disapproval when Margaret finally worked up the courage to ask him directly about the mountain man. "Margaret, I understand you're desperate," he'd said, his kind eyes filled with concern. "But that man, if the stories about him are even half true, is not someone you should involve with Thomas's care. He's not trained, not licensed, and frankly, some of his alleged methods border on the barbaric. But if there's even a chance, there isn't." Dr. Henley's voice had been firm, but not unkind. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've seen what happens when people chase false hope instead of accepting reality. Don't let desperation lead you down a path that could cause Thomas more harm." Yet here she was, 3 weeks after that conversation, standing at her window and watching the sun climb higher over the peaks where the mountain man was said to live. Thomas was in his room, struggling through arithmetic problems that seemed meaningless when measured against the magnitude of what he'd lost. His tutor, Miss Sarah from the schoolhouse, was patient and encouraging, but Margaret could see the pity in her eyes whenever she looked at Thomas's motionless legs. The broken rocking horse in the corner of Thomas's room served as a daily reminder of dreams deferred. Robert had carved it himself during the winter before Thomas was born, spending long evenings by the fire, shaping the wood with careful love. Thomas had outgrown it years ago, but it had remained in his room as a cherished symbol of his father's craftsmanship and devotion. Now it sat silent and still, much like its young owner. Margaret's reflection was interrupted by the sound of wheels approaching on the street outside. Sheriff Morrison's familiar figure appeared, his horse moving at the unhurried pace of a man, making his regular rounds. He touched his hat brim in greeting as he passed, and Margaret found herself wondering if he'd ever encountered the mysterious mountain man in his travels through the high country. The morning routine continued with the practiced efficiency born of necessity. Thomas needed help with tasks that had once been as natural as breathing: washing, dressing, transferring from his bed to his chair. Margaret had learned to assist without making him feel helpless, a delicate balance that required constant attention to his mood and pride. After breakfast, as Miss Sarah worked with Thomas on his lessons, Margaret found herself drawn to the small desk in the corner of the parlor where Robert had once managed their household accounts. The ledger book lay open, its columns telling a story of dwindling resources and growing desperation. The doctors in Denver had been expensive, but the real cost had been the modifications needed to make their home accessible. Ramps, railings, the special chair that allowed Thomas some independence. She closed the ledger and walked to the mantelpiece, where a daguerreotype of Robert smiled down at her with the confident expression of a man who believed he could protect his family from any hardship. If he were here now, what would he tell her to do? Would he counsel acceptance and adaptation? Or would he encourage her to exhaust every possibility, no matter how remote? The sound of children playing in the street drifted through the open window. Margaret watched as a group of boys ran past, their shouts of joy and abandon a painful reminder of what Thomas had lost. One of them, little Jimmy Morrison, the sheriff's youngest, paused to wave at Thomas through the window. Her son waved back with genuine warmth, but Margaret didn't miss the longing in his eyes as he watched his former playmates disappear around the corner. That evening, after Thomas had been settled in his bed and the house had grown quiet, Margaret made her decision. She retrieved a sheet of writing paper from Robert's desk and began composing a letter to her sister in Kansas City, asking if she might visit with Thomas for an extended stay. If she was going to pursue this desperate gambit, she wanted to ensure her son had somewhere safe to go if things went badly. The letter remained unfinished on her desk as sleep finally claimed her, but the decision had been made. Tomorrow she would begin asking the questions that might lead her to the mountain man. Whether he was charlatan or miracle worker, she had to know. The broken rocking horse in Thomas's room and the wedding ring on her finger both spoke to the same truth, that sometimes love required taking impossible risks in the face of certain heartbreak. As the moon rose over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Margaret whispered a prayer into the darkness. She asked not for miracles, though she would welcome them, but for the strength to face whatever lay ahead, and the wisdom to know when hope became delusion. The mountain man might be her last chance, or he might be the final cruel disappointment in a string of failures. But as she drifted towards sleep, Margaret Whitmore allowed herself to imagine Thomas running again, to picture his laughter filling their home as he chased some new adventure on legs that worked as God had intended them to work. Whether that vision was a prophecy or fantasy remained to be seen, but for tonight it was enough to sustain her through the darkness that had settled over their lives like a shroud. 3 days after Margaret made her decision, the answer came from an unexpected source. She was hanging laundry behind the house when old Pete Whitman shuffled up the path, his weathered face creased with the kind of deep lines that came from decades of mountain living. Pete rarely ventured into town, preferring the solitude of his small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, but when he did appear, people listened to what he had to say. "Mrs. Whitmore," he called out, removing his battered hat with the courtesy of a man raised in gentler times. "Heard you been asking questions about the fellow up in the high country." Margaret's hands stilled on the clothespin she'd been securing. Word travelled fast in a small town, despite her attempts at discretion. "I have been, Mr. Whitman, though I'm not sure I should admit it openly." Pete's chuckle was dry as autumn leaves. "Nothing wrong with seeking help where you can find it. That boy of yours deserves every chance." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, its edges worn soft from handling. "Drew this up for you. Best route to his place, marked with the landmarks you'll need." Margaret accepted the crude map with trembling fingers, studying the penciled lines that wound up into the mountainous terrain north of town. The path seemed to disappear into increasingly wild country, far from any established trails. "You've been there?" she asked. "Once, about 5 years back when my old mule got herself snake-bit. Thought she was a goner for sure." Pete's eyes grew distant with the memory. "Bear McKinnon worked on that animal for 3 days straight. Used things I'd never seen before, herbs and such. Mule lived another 4 years after that." Bear McKinnon, that's his real name? Jeremiah McKinnon, but ain't nobody called him that since he came back from the war. Goes by Bear now, and it suits him. Pete shifted his weight, glancing toward the mountains. Fair warning, though. He ain't what you call sociable. Turned away plenty of folks over the years, but he's got a soft spot for youngsters and those who really need help. Margaret folded the map carefully, slipping it into her apron pocket. What should I expect? How do I approach him? Just be honest. Bear's got a way of seeing through pretense. Don't try to charm him or convince him with fancy words. Tell him straight what's wrong and what you're hoping for. Pete replaced his hat, preparing to leave. And Mrs. Whitmore, take supplies for a few days. If he agrees to help, you might not be coming back down right away. The next morning dawned, clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that made the distant peaks seem close enough to touch. Margaret had spent the previous evening making preparations, packing a small bag with necessities and arranging for Mrs. Patterson to look after Thomas. She'd told her son she was going to Denver to consult with another specialist, a necessary deception that sat heavily on her conscience. When will you be back, Mama? Thomas had asked as she tucked him into bed the night before. A few days at most, sweetheart. Mrs. Patterson will take good care of you, and Miss Sarah will continue with your lessons. Thomas had nodded with the quiet acceptance that broke her heart. At 8 years old, he'd already learned not to expect too much from the adults in his world. Now, as Margaret secured her small pack to the saddle of Copper, the same gentle mare that had thrown Thomas, she whispered a prayer for courage and guidance. The irony of riding the horse that had caused their tragedy wasn't lost on her, but Copper was the strongest and most reliable mount they owned. The first part of the journey followed familiar trails, paths Margaret had ridden during happier times when family picnics and Sunday rides were regular pleasures. But as she climbed higher, following Pete's carefully drawn map, the terrain became increasingly wild and unfamiliar. The comfortable sounds of civilization, church bells, children's voices, the rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith shop, faded. Behind her, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant cry of hunting hawks. By midday, Margaret had reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on any official map. According to Pete's directions, she needed to take the narrower path to the left, one that seemed to disappear into a dense stand of aspen trees. As Copper picked her way carefully along the rocky trail, Margaret began to notice subtle signs that this route was used, despite its remote location. Branches had been broken back to allow passage, and occasional marks on tree trunks suggested someone maintained this pathway. The first trap appeared without warning. Copper shied suddenly, nearly unseating Margaret as the mare detected something. Her rider had missed. Looking down, Margaret saw the glint of metal barely concealed beneath a thin layer of fallen leaves. It wasn't designed to injure, she realized, but rather to announce the presence of visitors. Anyone passing this point would trigger a series of small bells hidden in the trees above. As if summoned by the subtle alarm, a voice called out from somewhere in the forest ahead. "That's far enough. State your business or turn around." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I'm Margaret Whitmore from Cedar Ridge. I've come to ask for your help." Help with what? The voice seemed to come from a different direction now, though she couldn't see anyone among the trees. "My son. He's 8 years old, and he can't walk. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do." A long silence followed, broken only by the gentle creaking of tree branches and Copper's nervous snorting. Margaret was beginning to wonder if she should repeat herself when a figure emerged from behind a massive pine trunk some 30 yards ahead. The man who stood before her was nothing like what she'd expected from the whispered descriptions around. Town. Yes, he was large, easily 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and thick arms of someone accustomed to physical labor. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. But his clothes, while practical and well-worn, were clean and well-maintained. Most surprising of all were his eyes, a deep brown that held intelligence and, unless she was mistaken, a profound sadness. "Jeremiah McKinnon," he said simply, making no move to approach. "Though most folks call me Bear, Margaret Whitmore." She dismounted slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements. "I know you don't know me, but I've heard you might be able to help when others can't." Bear studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical riding clothes and the determination etched in her features. "Heard wrong, most likely. I'm not a miracle worker, Mrs. Whitmore, just a man who prefers his solitude." "Please." The word came out more desperately than Margaret had intended. "I know how this must sound, coming from a stranger who's invaded your privacy, but my son, Thomas, he's all I have left in this world. If there's even the smallest chance you might know something the doctors don't, I have to try." Something shifted in Bear's expression, a flicker of recognition or understanding that passed too quickly for Margaret to interpret. "The doctors. How many have you seen?" "3 in Denver, the best specialists money could buy. They all said the same thing, that the damage to his spine is permanent." "And you don't believe them?" Margaret lifted her chin with the defiance that had sustained her through months of medical consultations and well-meaning advice. "I believe they're good men who know their trade, but I also believe they don't know everything there is to know about healing." Bear was quiet for so long that Margaret began to fear he would simply disappear back into the forest, leaving her with nothing but the long ride home and the bitter taste of final failure. But when he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made her pulse quicken with something that might have been hope. "I'll look at the boy, but I make no promises, and I don't work miracles. If I think there's nothing to be done, I'll tell." "You straight? Can you accept that?" "Yes." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Then follow me." "And Mrs. Whitmore." Bear's gaze met hers directly for the first time. "If you're thinking of deceiving me about anything, the nature of his injury, how it happened, what treatments he's already received, don't. I can't help if I don't have the truth." Margaret nodded, understanding that she'd just crossed a threshold from which there would be no easy return. As she led Copper along the narrow trail that Bear indicated, following him deeper into the wilderness than she'd ever ventured before, she clutched Pete's hand-drawn map like a talisman. The paper was damp with perspiration from her palm, but the careful markings remained clear, her lifeline back to the world she knew. Behind them, the gentle chiming of hidden bells marked their passage, a sound that seemed to announce not just their arrival in Bear McKinnon's domain, but the beginning of a journey that would test everything Margaret thought she knew about faith, healing, and the price of hope. Bear McKinnon's cabin stood in a clearing that seemed carved from the wilderness by careful hands rather than brute force. The structure itself was larger than Margaret had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of permanence rather than temporary shelter. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and she could see evidence of a well-tended garden plot behind the main building, now dormant for the winter, but clearly productive during growing season. "Built it myself," Bear said, noticing her appraisal. "Took the better part of 3 years to get it right." As they approached the front porch, Margaret noticed the carved walking stick leaning against the doorframe. It was a beautiful piece of work, crafted from what appeared to be oak and polished to a warm glow. The handle was worn smooth from use, but the intricate carving along its length showed a level of artistry that spoke to patience and skill. "That's lovely work," Margaret said, gesturing toward the stick. Bear's expression softened slightly. "Made it for my father when his knees started giving him trouble. Thought it might come in handy again someday." He paused on the porch steps, turning to face her directly. "Before we go any further, Mrs. Whitmore, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Tell me about the accident." Margaret recounted the story she'd relived countless times in her mind. Thomas on Copper, the startled snake, the terrible fall against the fence post. She described the immediate aftermath, the frantic ride to town with her unconscious son, and the awful hours of waiting while Dr. Henley worked to stabilize him. The fence post, Bear said when she finished. Was it wooden, metal, wood? An old cedar post that Robert had set when we first bought the property. Bear nodded thoughtfully. And the doctors, what exactly did they tell you about the nature of the damage? Margaret pulled the folded medical reports from her traveling bag, documents she'd carried to every consultation. Bear accepted them with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading such papers, his eyes moving methodically across the physician's notes and diagnoses. Says here the damage is primarily to the lumbar region, with some involvement of the lower thoracic vertebrae. Bear looked up from the papers. Did they explain what that means in terms you could understand? They said the nerves that control. His legs were severely injured when his spine was compressed against the fence post, that the signals from his brain can't get through to tell his legs to move. And sensation? Can he feel anything below the injury? Some. He can feel pressure and temperature changes in his upper legs, but nothing below his knees. Bear handed the papers back to her, his expression thoughtful. The presence of sensation is significant. It suggests the damage might not be as complete as the doctors assumed. He gestured toward the cabin door. I'd like to examine him myself, but first I need to explain something about how I work. Inside the cabin, Margaret was surprised by the orderliness and cleanliness of Bear's living space. Medical texts sat alongside books on botany and anatomy on carefully built shelves. Glass jars filled with dried herbs lined one wall, each labeled in precise handwriting. This was clearly the workspace of someone with extensive knowledge and systematic methods. I served as a medic during the war, Bear began, settling into a chair across from where Margaret sat. Saw more broken bodies in 4 years than most doctors see in a lifetime. Learned that sometimes conventional medicine doesn't have all the answers, especially when it comes to nerve damage and spinal injuries. He rose and moved to a cabinet, withdrawing several bound journals. These contain notes on cases I've treated since coming here. Not many, mind you. I don't advertise my services, but there have been some successes with conditions the town. Doctors couldn't help. Margaret leaned forward, studying the careful diagrams and detailed notes visible on the open pages. You've helped others, like Thomas. Not exactly like Thomas, no. But I've seen cases where patience, proper treatment and time accomplished what surgery and bed rest couldn't. Bear closed the journal and met her eyes. The key is understanding that healing isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about finding new pathways, teaching the body to work around the damage. Would you be willing to come down to Cedar Ridge to examine Thomas? Bear was quiet for several heartbeats, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Whatever had driven him to this isolated existence, leaving it, even temporarily, was clearly not a decision he made lightly. I'll come, he said finally, but there are conditions. No crowds, no spectators wanting to see the mountain man at work. Just you, me, and the boy. And if I determine there's nothing I can do, that's the end of it. No pleading, no bargaining. Agreed. When would be best? Margaret considered the logistics. Mrs. Patterson could continue watching Thomas for another day or two, but beyond that, people would start asking questions. Tomorrow evening. Most folks will be at the church social. We'd have privacy. Bear nodded. I'll ride down after sunset. Have the boy comfortable and relaxed. This won't be a quick examination. The journey back to Cedar Ridge passed more quickly than the ascent, partly because Margaret now knew the route, and partly because her mind was occupied with hope and apprehension in equal measure. As the familiar buildings of town came into view, she felt the weight of the secret she now carried. Tomorrow night, she would either take the first step toward healing her son, or she would face the final confirmation that his condition was indeed permanent. Thomas greeted her return with the quiet enthusiasm that had become his way, asking polite questions about her trip to Denver, while clearly not expecting detailed answers. Mrs. Patterson had kept him well fed and entertained, though Margaret could see the subtle signs of his growing restlessness. 8-year-old boys weren't meant to spend their days confined to chairs and beds, no matter how comfortable the surroundings. That evening, as Margaret helped Thomas prepare for bed, she found herself studying his legs with new eyes. According to Bear, the presence of sensation in his upper legs was significant. Could there really be pathways for healing that the Denver specialists had overlooked? "Mama, you seem different," Thomas observed as she adjusted his blankets. "Did the doctor in Denver say something new?" Margaret had always tried to be honest with her son, but this situation called for careful navigation between truth and hope. "I met someone who might be able to help in ways the other doctors couldn't. He's coming to visit you tomorrow evening." Thomas's eyes brightened with cautious interest. A new doctor. Someone with different knowledge, different methods. "But Thomas, I need you to understand that this might not lead anywhere. I don't want you to get your hopes too high." "I understand, Mama." Thomas's voice carried a maturity that no 8-year-old should have to possess. "But it's okay to hope a little bit, isn't it?" Margaret kissed his forehead, her heart breaking with love for this brave little boy who had learned to temper his expectations without losing his spirit entirely. "Yes, sweetheart, it's okay to hope a little bit." The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself checking the clock every few minutes, alternating between anticipation and dread. What if Bear took one look at Thomas and immediately declared the case hopeless? What if the examination revealed damage even worse than the specialists had discovered? What if this desperate gamble only served to deepen their despair? As sunset approached and the sounds of people gathering for the church social drifted through the windows, Margaret felt her nerves stretched to the breaking point. Thomas seemed to sense her tension, asking twice if she was feeling well and offering to postpone the visit if she wasn't up to it. The soft knock at the back door came just as full darkness settled over Cedar Ridge. Margaret opened it to find Bear McKinnon standing in the shadows, a leather satchel in his hand and his expression carefully neutral. He'd cleaned up for the occasion. His beard was neatly trimmed, and he wore what appeared to be his best shirt beneath a heavy coat. "Mrs. Whitmore," he nodded politely. "Is the boy ready?" "He's in his room." "Bear, Mr. McKinnon, I want to thank you for doing this. I know it's not easy for you to come down here." "Let's see what we find before we start with the thanks," Bear replied gently. "Lead the way." As they walked through the house toward Thomas's room, Margaret found herself acutely aware of how their home must appear to someone accustomed to the Spartan simplicity of mountain living. The furniture that had once seemed elegant now felt ostentatious, the decorative touches excessive. But Bear's attention seemed focused entirely on the task ahead, his observant gaze taking in the wheelchair, accessibility modifications, and the general layout with professional interest. Thomas was sitting up in bed when they entered his room, his hands folded in his lap with the formal posture he adopted when meeting adults. His eyes widened slightly as he took in Bear's imposing figure, but he showed no fear. "You must be Thomas," Bear said, his voice taking on a gentler tone than Margaret had heard before. "I'm Bear McKinnon. Your mother asked me to take a look at your legs and see if there might be something we can do to help." "Yes, sir." Thomas glanced at his mother for reassurance, then back at Bear. "Mama says you know things the other doctors don't." "I know some different things," Bear corrected, carefully. "Whether they'll be helpful in your case remains to be seen." He set his satchel on the bedside table and removed his coat. "Now then, I need to examine your legs and back pretty thoroughly. It might be uncomfortable, but I promise I won't do anything that will hurt you. Fair enough?" Thomas nodded solemnly, and Margaret felt her heart clench with pride at her son's courage. Whatever the outcome of this examination, he was facing it with the same quiet bravery that had sustained him through months of medical procedures and disappointing diagnoses. Bear's hands, Margaret noticed, were surprisingly gentle for their size as he began his examination. The carved walking stick remained propped against the doorframe, a silent reminder of the hope and skill that had created it, waiting patiently for the moment when it might be needed once again. Bear's examination of Thomas was unlike anything Margaret had witnessed during their visits to the specialists in Denver. Where the city doctors had relied primarily on instruments and clinical tests, Bear used his hands as diagnostic tools, his fingers probing gently along Thomas's spine with the careful attention of someone reading a complex text written in a language only he understood. "Can you feel this?" Bear asked, pressing lightly at a point just below Thomas's shoulder blades. "Yes, sir. That tickles a little." Bear made a note in a small journal he'd withdrawn from his satchel, then moved his hands lower, repeating the process. "And this, I can feel the pressure, but it's different, like it's far away. That's exactly the kind of information I need," Bear said approvingly. "You're very good at describing what you feel, Thomas. That's going to help us a great deal." Margaret watched from her chair beside the bed, fascinated by the thoroughness of Bear's assessment. He tested Thomas's reflexes with a small hammer, examined the alignment of his spine, and spent considerable time manipulating the boy's legs through various ranges of motion. Throughout the examination, he maintained a running commentary that was clearly intended to put Thomas at ease. "Your mother tells me you're quite the horseman," Bear said as he worked. "Been riding long?" "Since I was 5. Papa taught me on Copper. She's the gentlest mare you ever saw, usually." Thomas's voice grew quieter with the last word. "Accidents happen, son, even with the gentlest animals. It doesn't mean you or Copper did anything wrong." Bear's hands paused in their examination. "Tell me, when you dream about riding, can you feel your legs gripping the saddle?" Thomas's eyes widened with surprise. "How did you know I dream about riding?" "Because that's what I'd dream about if I were in your situation. The mind remembers what the body used to do. Sometimes that memory can be useful in healing." After nearly an hour of careful examination, Bear helped Thomas settle back comfortably in his bed and turned to address Margaret. "I'd like to speak with you privately, if you don't mind. Thomas, you've been an excellent patient, better than most adults I've worked with." Thomas beamed at the praise, and Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward this gentle giant who had treated her son with such respect and dignity. They moved to the parlor, leaving Thomas's door slightly ajar so he wouldn't feel excluded from the conversation about his condition. "Well?" Margaret asked, trying to read Bear's expression. Bear settled into Robert's old chair, his large frame making the furniture seem suddenly small. From his satchel, he withdrew a bundle of dried plants, tied with string, mountain herbs that gave off a pleasant, earthy aroma. "The good news is that the damage isn't as complete as the Denver doctors believed," he began. "Thomas has more sensation and nerve function remaining than their reports indicated. The bad news is that what they told you about the difficulty of recovery was accurate. This won't be quick and there are no guarantees." Margaret leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "But you think there's a chance?" "I think there's enough intact nerve pathway to work with, yes. But Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand what would be involved. This wouldn't be a matter of a few treatments and miraculous recovery. We're talking about months of daily work, exercises, massage, herbal treatments, and a level of commitment that would essentially become your full-time occupation. I'll do whatever it takes." Bear studied her carefully. "It would mean trusting methods that conventional medicine doesn't recognize. Some of what I do comes from my medical training during the war, but much of it comes from knowledge past, down by the native peoples who lived in these mountains before us. Are you comfortable with that?" Margaret thought of the whispered conversations in town, the warnings about ungodly practices and dangerous remedies. Then she looked toward Thomas's room, where her son lay trapped in a body that no longer obeyed his will. "If it might help Thomas, then yes, I'm comfortable with it." Bear nodded and untied the bundle of herbs, spreading them on the small table between their chairs. "These are willow bark for pain and inflammation, devil's claw root for muscle tension, and a few others specific to nerve healing. I'll teach you how to prepare them into teas and poultices. You're willing to treat him? I'm willing to try, but there are conditions beyond what we discussed yesterday. First, no one else can know the details of what we're doing. If word gets around about my methods, we'll have interference from well-meaning folks who don't understand what we're attempting, Margaret nodded, understanding the delicate position this put Bear in. Dr. Henley will oppose what we're doing if he finds out. I don't blame him. From his perspective, we're pursuing unproven treatments when the boy should be focusing on adaptation to his condition. But sometimes unproven doesn't mean ineffective. Bear reached into his satchel and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with detailed notes and diagrams. This contains everything I've learned about treating spinal injuries over the past 15 years. Some cases succeeded, others didn't. But the ones that worked all had certain things in common. He opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon, revealing a detailed sketch of the human spine, alongside notes written in precise handwriting. The key is understanding that the spine isn't just bone and nerve. It's part of a complex system that includes muscles, circulation, and what some might call the body's natural healing energy. How do we begin? Tomorrow, I'll bring down additional supplies, and we'll start with basic treatments. Herbal baths to improve circulation, gentle massage to stimulate nerve pathways, and exercises designed to maintain muscle tone while encouraging new neural connections. Margaret felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months, genuine hope tempered by realistic expectations. How long before we might see results? Every case is different. Some patients show improvement within weeks, others take months. A few show initial progress and then plateau. But Thomas has several factors working in his favor: his age, his general health before the accident, and most importantly, his attitude. His attitude. Bear smiled for the first time since entering their home. He hasn't given up, Mrs. Whitmore. Despite everything he's been through, he still believes recovery is possible. That kind of faith can be more powerful than any medicine I might provide. They spent another hour discussing the practical aspects of treatment, scheduling supplies needed, and the story they would tell curious neighbors about Bear's frequent visits. Margaret suggested they could say he was helping with some repairs around the property, work that Robert had left unfinished. As Bear prepared to leave, he paused at Thomas's door to say goodnight. "I'll see you tomorrow, son. We're going to start working on getting those legs of yours back in the proper working order." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice bright with carefully controlled excitement. "Mr. McKinnon, do you really think I might walk again?" Bear was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think your body still remembers how to walk, Thomas. Sometimes it just needs help remembering. We're going to give it all the help we can." After Bear left, disappearing into the darkness, as quietly as he'd arrived, Margaret sat beside Thomas's bed and listened to his excited whispers about the mountain man who might hold the key to his recovery. For the first time in months, her son fell asleep with a smile on his face. Later, as Margaret prepared for bed herself, she found herself studying the bundle of herbs Bear had left behind. The plants seemed to carry the essence of the wild places where they'd grown: clean air, rushing water, and the ancient wisdom of mountains that had stood long before the first settlers arrived in this valley. She thought about Bear's words regarding Thomas's attitude and realized that her son wasn't the only one who needed to believe in the possibility of healing. As she drifted towards sleep, Margaret allowed herself to imagine Thomas running again, but this time the vision felt less like fantasy and more like a goal worth fighting for. The carved walking stick remained in Thomas's room, propped in the corner where Bear had left it. In the moonlight streaming through the window, it seemed to stand sentinel over the sleeping boy, a symbol of craftsmanship, patience, and the belief that broken things could sometimes be made whole again. Outside, the mountains where Bear McKinnon made his home rose like ancient guardians against the star-filled sky, holding secrets of healing that were far older than the medical textbooks gathering dust in Denver physicians' offices. Tomorrow would begin a journey into those mysteries, and Margaret Whitmore fell asleep with her hand resting on the bundle of healing herbs, her heart finally daring to hope. 3 weeks into Bear's treatment regimen, Thomas experienced his first breakthrough. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing the morning herbal tea when she heard an excited shout from the parlor where Bear was conducting the daily therapy session. "Mama, Mama, come quick!" Margaret dropped the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the willow bark tea and rushed into the room, her heart hammering with a mixture of hope and fear. She found Thomas sitting in his chair, his face flushed with excitement, while Bear knelt beside him with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Tell her what happened, son," Bear encouraged. "I moved my toe." Thomas's words tumbled out in a rush. "Mr. Bear was working on my foot, and I thought about wiggling my big toe, and it moved. Just a little bit, but it really moved." Margaret sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Show me." Bear positioned Thomas's bare foot so Margaret could see clearly, then nodded to the boy. Thomas's face scrunched with concentration, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he focused all his attention on his right foot. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, his big toe twitched. "Dear God," Margaret whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "How is this possible?" "The nerve pathways are beginning to reconnect," Bear explained, his voice calm but unable to completely hide his own excitement. "It's exactly what we hoped might happen. The daily massage, the herbal treatments, and the exercises are encouraging new neural growth." Thomas wiggled his toe again, this small movement representing a victory larger than any military conquest. "Does this mean I'm going to walk again?" Bear placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "It means we're making progress, Thomas. Real, measurable progress, but we still have a long way to go. This is just the beginning." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to contain emotions that ranged from overwhelming joy to cautious disbelief. "What comes next?" "We continue with the treatments, but now we add specific exercises designed to strengthen the renewed nerve connections. And Thomas, you'll need to keep a diary of every sensation you feel, no matter how small. Recovery often happens in tiny increments that are easy to miss if we're not paying careful attention." Bear reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a small bound journal with blank pages. The cover was made of soft leather, and the pages were good quality paper, clearly something he'd chosen with care. "This will be your recovery diary. Son, write down everything you feel in your legs and feet every day, even things that seem unimportant." Thomas accepted the diary with the solemnity of someone receiving a sacred trust. "I'll write in it every morning and every evening." "That's exactly right, and Thomas, today marks the beginning of a new chapter in your story. Remember this feeling, because on the difficult days ahead, and there will be difficult days, you'll need to remind yourself that healing is possible." Over the following days, Thomas's progress accelerated in small but measurable ways. The toe movement became more pronounced and deliberate. He began to feel tingling sensations in his other toes, and eventually reported being able to move his left big toe as well. Each entry in his leather-bound diary recorded these victories with the careful attention of a scholar, documenting important discoveries. Margaret found herself walking on air, her step lighter than it had been since the accident. The transformation wasn't limited to Thomas. She could feel hope returning to their household like sunlight after a long winter. Even their daily routines took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of possible recovery. The challenge came from managing this newfound optimism while maintaining the secrecy Bear had insisted upon. Dr. Henley made his regular weekly visit, and Margaret had to work to keep her excitement contained as he conducted his standard examination of Thomas. "The boy seems in good spirits," Dr. Henley observed as he packed his medical bag. "That's important for overall health, even if his physical condition remains unchanged." Margaret bit her tongue to keep from sharing the miraculous news of Thomas's toe movement. "Yes, he's been very positive lately. And you, Margaret, you look better than you have in months. Getting more rest, I hope." "I've been feeling more hopeful about things in general," she replied carefully. "Taking better care of myself so I can take better care of Thomas." After Dr. Henley left, Margaret felt the strain of maintaining these careful deceptions. Bear had warned her that premature revelation of Thomas's progress could bring unwanted attention and skepticism that might interfere with the healing process. But the secrecy weighed heavily on her natural honesty. The weight of their secret became even more challenging when Mrs. Patterson commented on the changes she observed in the household. "There's something different about this place lately," the elderly woman said as she helped Margaret prepare lunch. "A lightness in the air that wasn't here before." And Thomas, "I haven't seen that boy smile so much since before the accident." "He's been in good spirits," Margaret agreed, focusing intently on the vegetables she was chopping. "It's more than good spirits, dear. It's like he believes something wonderful is going to happen." Mrs. Patterson paused in her stirring to study Margaret's face. "You haven't gotten his hopes up about something impossible, have you? I'd hate to see that child disappointed again." Margaret set down her knife and met her neighbor's concerned gaze. "Mrs. Patterson, I would never intentionally mislead Thomas about his condition, but I also believe it's important to maintain hope. As long as he's not in danger, what harm can optimism do?" Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly, though her expression remained thoughtful. "I suppose you're right. That boy has been through enough heartbreak for a lifetime. If hope helps him cope, then I'm all for it." The conversation left Margaret feeling even more isolated by the secret she carried. She longed to share Thomas's progress with someone who would understand its significance, but Bear's warnings about premature disclosure echoed in her mind. Too much attention too soon could bring criticism from medical authorities and pressure that might interfere with the delicate process of healing. That evening, as Bear conducted his regular treatment session, Margaret broached the subject of their enforced secrecy. "How long do we need to keep this quiet?" she asked as Bear worked on Thomas's legs with patient, methodical movements. "Until the progress is undeniable," Bear replied without pausing in his massage techniques. "Right now, toe movement could be dismissed as muscle spasms or wishful thinking. We need more substantial improvement before we can risk skeptical examination." "But surely Dr. Henley would want to know." "Dr. Henley would want to study how this improvement occurred, which would mean bringing in other physicians, possibly taking Thomas to Denver for additional tests, and generally disrupting the very treatment that's working." Bear's hands stilled on Thomas's calf. "I've seen it happen before, Mrs. Whitmore. Well-meaning doctors who insist on understanding the mechanism before allowing the healing to continue." Thomas looked up from his diary, where he'd been recording the day's sensations. "I don't mind keeping it secret, Mama. Mr. Bear knows what's best." The trust in her son's voice was both heartwarming and sobering. Thomas had invested his faith completely in Bear's methods, and Margaret realized she'd done the same. They were all committed to this path now, with its promise of healing and its demand for patience. "There's something else we need to discuss," Bear said, his tone becoming more serious. "Thomas is going to need proper equipment as his mobility improves. The wheelchair is fine for now, but eventually we'll want to transition to walking aids." He gestured toward the carved walking stick that had become a permanent fixture in Thomas's room. That stick was made for an adult, but the craftsmanship techniques could be adapted for a smaller frame. "With your permission, I'd like to begin working on crutches and a child-sized walking stick." "You'd make them yourself?" "Wood carving has been a hobby of mine since childhood. It's peaceful work, and I've made walking aids before." Bear's expression grew distant. "My father needed them in his later years. I learned that the fit and balance have to be perfect, or they cause more problems than they solve." Margaret thought about the carved walking stick in Thomas's room, with its smooth handle and intricate detailing. The idea of Bear crafting similar aids specifically for her son filled her with a warmth that went beyond gratitude. "That would be wonderful. Thomas would treasure anything you made for him." "Can I help?" Thomas asked eagerly. "I'd like to learn wood carving." Bear smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Margaret had seen from him. "I think that could be arranged. Working with your hands while your legs heal might be exactly what you need." As the session concluded, and Bear prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the back door, as had become their custom. These brief, private moments allowed them to discuss Thomas's progress without the boy overhearing every detail. "He's doing remarkably well," Bear said as he gathered his supplies. "Better than I dared hope at this stage. And you? How are you managing these daily trips to town?" Bear paused in securing his satchel, glancing up at Margaret with surprise. "I'm managing fine. Why do you ask?" "Because I know this isn't easy for you. Leaving your mountain sanctuary every day, dealing with the possibility of being seen and recognized." Margaret hesitated, then pressed on. "I want you to know how much I appreciate the sacrifice you're making for Thomas." "It's not a sacrifice," Bear said quietly. "That boy reminds me why I learned healing in the first place. Before the war, before—" He stopped abruptly, his expression closing off. Before what? Bear was silent for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "Before I lost my own family, my wife Sarah and our daughter Emma, they died in a fire while I was away on a hunting trip. I've been living in those mountains for 5 years, trying to forget what it felt like to have something worth protecting." Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy. "Bear, I'm so sorry. Thomas is giving me a reason to use my skills for something other than my own solitude. If anything, I should be thanking you for the opportunity." As Margaret watched Bear disappear into the darkness, she understood something new about the man who was healing her son. He wasn't just treating Thomas's injured spine, he was healing his own wounded spirit. The realization added another layer of meaning to the miraculous progress occurring in their home. Later that night, as she checked on Thomas before bed, Margaret found him writing in his diary by lamplight. His face was serious with concentration, as he carefully recorded the day's experiences. "What are you writing about tonight?" she asked. Thomas looked up with a smile that seemed to light the entire room. "I'm writing about Mr. Bear and how he's teaching me to believe in impossible things. And Mama, I can feel my toes getting stronger every day. Pretty soon, I think I'm going to surprise everyone." Margaret kissed his forehead and adjusted his blankets, her heart full of gratitude for the mountain man who had brought hope back into their lives. The carved walking stick stood ready in the corner, waiting for the day when Thomas would be ready to claim it and take his first steps toward a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. 6 weeks after the first toe movement, Thomas achieved something that took everyone by surprise. He bent his knee. It happened during an afternoon session when Bear was teaching Thomas the wood-carving techniques he'd promised. They were working on a simple project, a small wooden horse that Thomas could shape with careful knife work, when the boy shifted position in his chair and his right leg moved in a way that had been impossible since the accident. "Did you see that?" Thomas gasped, staring down at his leg in amazement. Bear set down his carving knife and moved to examine Thomas's knee joint. "Do it again, son. Focus on bending your knee toward your chest." Thomas closed his eyes, his face tightening. With concentration, slowly, almost hesitantly, his right knee began to bend. The movement was small and clearly required enormous effort, but it was unmistakably voluntary. "Mama!" Thomas called out, his voice cracking with excitement. "Mama, come see!" Margaret rushed in from the kitchen where she'd been preparing the afternoon herbal treatment, arriving just in time to witness her son's right leg lift several inches off the chair's footrest. The sight sent a shock of joy through her system, so powerful that she had to grip the doorframe for support. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's wonderful." Bear's expression was one of professional satisfaction mixed with personal delight. From his leather satchel, he withdrew a small, tarnished military medal attached to a faded ribbon. Margaret could see it was some kind of medical corps insignia, worn and weathered from years of handling. "This belonged to my commanding officer," Bear said, holding the medal so Thomas could see it clearly. "Captain Williams was the finest battlefield surgeon I ever knew." He taught me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about having faith that the human body wants to heal itself. Bear placed the medal in Thomas's palm. He gave this to me when I left the service, told me to pass it on to someone who understood what real courage looks like. I think he'd want you to have it. Thomas stared at the medal with reverence, understanding that he was receiving something precious. Are you sure? I'm sure. You've shown more bravery in these past weeks than most soldiers show in years of combat, and this medal has always brought good luck to whoever carried it. Margaret watched this exchange with a heart so full of emotion she could barely speak. The sight of her son holding that military medal, his legs showing the first real signs of recovery, created a moment of perfect hope that seemed to crystallize all their months of struggle into this single shining instant. "What does this mean for his treatment?" Margaret asked, after Thomas had carefully tucked the medal into his diary for safekeeping. "It means we're entering a new phase," Bear replied. "The nerve pathways are reconnecting faster than I expected. We can begin more active exercises now, controlled movements designed to strengthen the renewed connections and encourage further healing." Over the following days, Thomas's progress accelerated dramatically. The knee movement became more pronounced and consistent. He began to report tingling sensations throughout his right leg and eventually started feeling similar stirrings in his left leg. Each day brought new entries in his diary, careful records of sensations and movements that documented a remarkable recovery. But with progress came new challenges. The secret they'd been guarding so carefully became increasingly difficult to maintain, as Thomas's excitement bubbled over into his interactions with visitors. When Miss Sarah came for his lessons, he could barely contain himself, fidgeting in his chair and making cryptic references to good things happening soon. The real test came when Sheriff Morrison stopped by for one of his regular visits. Thomas had always enjoyed the sheriff's stories, but today he seemed distracted, more interested in showing off the carved wooden horse he'd been working on than listening to tales of frontier justice. "That's fine craftsmanship, son, Sheriff," Morrison said, examining the small horse with genuine appreciation. "Where'd you learn to carve like that?" Thomas glanced at his mother before answering. "A friend has been teaching me. He says working with your hands helps other parts of your body remember how to work too." Margaret felt her pulse quicken at the innocent revelation, but Sheriff Morrison seemed to take the comment as simple childhood philosophy. "That's wise thinking. I've always found that keeping busy helps when times are tough." The sheriff returned the carving to Thomas and turned to Margaret. "Speaking of friends, I've been hearing some interesting rumors around town." "What kind of rumors?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Folks have been seeing smoke from campfires up in the high country more than usual for this time of year. And Jake Peterson swears he saw someone riding down from the mountain trails after dark a few nights back." Sheriff Morrison's expression was curious rather than concerned. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Margaret felt the weight of Bear's warnings about premature disclosure, but she also knew Sheriff Morrison well enough to recognize that he'd already pieced together more than he was letting on. "There might be someone helping us with some repairs around the property," she said carefully. "Work that Robert left unfinished." Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the subtle changes around the house. The wood shavings from Thomas's carving projects, the unfamiliar herbs drying on the kitchen windowsill, the general air of hope that seemed to permeate the household. "Well, if this friend of yours ever needs anything from town, you let me know. Any man willing to help a widow and her boy is welcome in Cedar Ridge, as far as I'm concerned." Bear also learned that Blackwood had been purchasing surrounding properties at below-market prices, often from families facing financial difficulties. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to acquire large sections of land for development or mining operations. That evening, as Bear concluded what might be his last normal therapy session with Thomas, the boy sensed something had changed. "Mr. Bear, you seem different today. And Mama's been quiet all afternoon." Thomas's young face was creased with concern. "Did I do something wrong with my exercises?" Bear knelt beside Thomas's chair, his expression gentle despite the gravity of their situation. "You didn't do anything wrong, son. In fact, you've done everything right. But there are some adults who aren't happy about how well you're healing. Why? Wouldn't they want me to get better?" Bear exchanged a glance with Margaret before answering. "Because your recovery is going to prove some things they don't want proven. But Thomas, I need you to listen carefully. Tomorrow might be very different from the days we've been having. You might need to be braver than you've ever been before." Thomas straightened in his chair, and Margaret saw a flash of the man he would someday become. "I can be brave, Mr. Bear. Whatever you need me to do, I know you can, son. And when this is all over, I think you're going to surprise everyone with just how much you've healed." As Bear prepared to leave that night, he gave Margaret specific instructions for the next day. "Keep Thomas inside, away from windows. Don't answer the door for anyone except Sheriff Morrison or Dr. Henley. And whatever happens Friday night, remember that Blackwood's power comes from secrecy and intimidation. Once the truth is out, he loses most of his advantage. Will you be here Friday when he comes?" Bear's smile was grim but reassuring. "I'll be here, Mrs. Whitmore, and I'll bring some friends who understand how to deal with men like Harrison Blackwood." After Bear left, Margaret found herself standing in Thomas's room, staring at the carved walking stick that represented so much hope and determination. The military medal lay open in Thomas's diary, catching the lamplight like a promise of courage. "In dark times, Mama," Thomas said softly from his bed, "I know something bad is happening, but I also know Mr. Bear won't let anyone hurt us." Margaret kissed her son's forehead, drawing strength from his faith. "No, sweetheart, he won't let anyone hurt us. And Thomas, I think it's time the whole world knew how strong and brave you really are." As she tucked the threatening letter away in Robert's desk, Margaret felt a cold determination settle over her. Harrison Blackwood had made the mistake of believing that a widow and her disabled child would be easy targets for his schemes. He was about to learn that some families, when pushed too far, would fight back with everything they had. The carved walking stick stood ready in the corner, no longer just a symbol of hope, but a promise that Thomas would rise from his chair and walk again. Not just as a testament to healing, but as proof that evil could not triumph over love, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Thursday brought an unseasonable warmth to Cedar Ridge, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath for what was to come. Margaret spent the morning following Bear's instructions, keeping Thomas inside and away from windows, while maintaining their normal routine as much as possible. Sheriff Morrison arrived just after noon, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by a serious expression that told Margaret he already knew more about their situation than she'd expected. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into the parlor, "I understand you might be having some unwelcome visitors tomorrow evening." Margaret glanced toward Thomas's room, where her son was working on his wood carving project. With forced concentration. "How did you? Bear McKinnon paid me a visit early this morning. Told me some interesting things about your boy's accident and about certain businessmen who don't understand the meaning of the word no." Sheriff Morrison's jaw was set with quiet anger. "I've been doing some investigating of my own." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small cloth bag, setting it on the table between them. "Found this buried near your fence line yesterday. Recognize it?" Margaret opened the bag to find a metal snake, cunningly crafted to look realistic from a distance. Its surface was smooth enough to slide easily through grass, and small holes in its head would have allowed it to make a convincing hissing sound when pulled by a hidden string. "Dear God," she whispered, the full horror of the deception washing over her. "They used this to spook Copper. That's what I figure. Probably had a man hidden in the brush with a long cord, waiting for Thomas to ride past." Sheriff Morrison's voice was grim. "I also found traces of where someone had weakened that fence post, cut partway through from the back side where it wouldn't show, When Thomas hit it, it was designed to break in exactly the way that would cause maximum injury. Margaret felt sick with rage and grief. Her son's months of suffering, his lost childhood, her own desperation, all of it had been deliberately orchestrated by men who saw profit in a little boy's pain. "What can we do legally?" she asked. "That's the problem. This evidence proves someone set a trap, but it doesn't prove who ordered it. Blackwood's too smart to have his own hands dirty with the actual work." Sheriff Morrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But Bear tells me young Thomas has been making some remarkable progress lately." Margaret nodded, understanding that they were moving beyond the need for secrecy. "He's been getting feeling back in his legs. Yesterday he managed to move both knees voluntarily. That's what Bear said, and he has an idea about how we might use that progress to expose Blackwood's scheme." Sheriff Morrison glanced toward Thomas's room. "But it's going to require that boy to be braver than any 8-year-old should have to be." That afternoon, Bear arrived earlier than usual, accompanied by 2 men Margaret didn't recognize. One was clearly a former soldier like Bear. His bearing and alertness marked him as someone accustomed to dangerous situations. The other was older, with the precise manner of a professional man. "Mrs. Whitmore," Bear said as they gathered in the parlor, "I'd like you to meet Sergeant James Walsh, who served with me during the war, and Mr. Daniel Foster, who's a lawyer from Denver with experience in land fraud cases." Foster stepped forward with a slight bow. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed the information Mr. McKinnon provided, and I believe we have grounds for both criminal and civil action against Mr. Blackwood. But we need to catch him in the act of making threats or admissions of guilt." "How do we do that?" Walsh spoke up, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd been in difficult situations before. "We're going to record tomorrow night's conversation. I have equipment that will capture everything said in this room without being detected." Bear knelt beside Thomas's chair, his expression serious but encouraging. "Son, tomorrow night you're going to show Mr. Blackwood just how much you've recovered. But it needs to be a surprise. We want him to think you're still completely paralyzed, until the moment you prove otherwise." Thomas's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want me to pretend I can't move my legs? Until the right moment? Yes. And then, when he's made his threats and revealed his plans, you're going to stand up and show him that his scheme has failed." Bear placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Do you think you're strong enough to do that?" Thomas straightened in his chair with determination. "I can do it, Mr. Bear, and I want to. What he did to our family, what he did to Mama, he should pay for that." Margaret felt a surge of pride at her son's courage, mixed with maternal fear. For what they were asking him to risk. What if something goes wrong? What if Blackwood becomes violent when he realizes his plan has failed? Walsh patted the concealed holster beneath his coat. "That's why I'm here, Ma'am, along with a few other precautions we've arranged." Foster opened his leather briefcase and withdrew several documents. "I've also been in contact with the Territorial Mining Office. Your late husband's geological surveys were more prescient than you might have realized. There are significant silver deposits on your land, enough to make you independently wealthy if properly developed. Which explains why Blackwood was so determined to acquire your property," Bear added. "He's been using information from incomplete territorial surveys to identify valuable land and then forcing sales through intimidation and manufactured crises." Margaret studied the legal documents, trying to process the implications. So Thomas's accident was just business to him. "Worse than that," Foster replied grimly. "It was a calculated investment. Injure the child, create medical expenses and emotional pressure, then swoop in as the sympathetic businessman offering financial relief in exchange for property rights." The rest of the afternoon was spent in careful preparation. Walsh tested his recording equipment, ensuring it would capture clear audio from anywhere in the parlor. Foster reviewed the questions and statements that would be most likely to elicit incriminating responses from Blackwood. Bear worked with Thomas on the physical challenge ahead, demonstrating that the boy could indeed rise from his chair and take several steps with the support of the carved walking stick. "Remember," Bear coached, "you don't need to walk perfectly or even very far. Just standing up and taking a few steps will be enough to prove that the doctor's original prognosis was wrong." Thomas practiced the sequence several times, each attempt growing more confident. His movements were still careful and deliberate, but the fact that he could stand and walk at all represented a medical miracle that would expose Blackwood's assumption that the boy remained completely paralyzed. As evening approached and their preparations neared completion, Margaret found herself alone with Bear for a few minutes, while the others checked their equipment in the next room. "Are you certain this will work?" she asked. Bear removed his hidden rifle from where he'd concealed it behind the bookshelf, checking its load with practiced efficiency. "The plan will work, Margaret, but I need you to understand that after tomorrow night, everything changes. Blackwood's scheme will be exposed, your financial problems will be solved, and Thomas will be on his way to a full recovery. And you? What happens to you after this is over?" Bear was quiet for a moment, his attention seemingly focused on the rifle's mechanisms. "I've been thinking about that. These past months being part of your family's healing, it's reminded me of who I used to be before grief drove me into the mountains. Who were you before? A man who believed that healing others was the highest calling a person could have. A man who understood that connection and purpose were more important than solitude and safety." Bear looked up at Margaret directly. "I don't want to go back to the mountains, Margaret. I want to stay here in Cedar Ridge, where I can use my skills to help people who need them." Margaret felt her heart skip at the implications of his words. The town could use a doctor. Dr. Henley isn't getting any younger, and he's always said he'd welcome help with difficult cases. "Is that the only reason you'd want me to stay?" The question hung between them, loaded with months of growing trust, shared purpose, and something deeper that neither had dared to name. Margaret thought about the carved walking stick that had become a symbol of hope, about the gentle way Bear worked with Thomas, about the gradual healing of not just her son's body, but her own heart. "No," she said quietly, "that's not the only reason." Before Bear could respond, Thomas called out from the parlor. "Mr. Bear, Mama, I think I can hear horses coming up the road." They rushed to the window, peering carefully through the curtains. In the distance, a fine carriage approached their house, flanked by two men on horseback. Even in the gathering dusk, Margaret could see that the riders carried themselves with the casual menace of professional intimidators. "He's early," Walsh observed, checking his pocket watch, "and he brought more men than we expected." Bear's expression hardened into the focused calm of a soldier preparing for battle. "It doesn't matter. We're ready for him." He turned to Thomas, who sat in his chair with the carved walking stick within easy reach. "Remember, son, wait for the right moment. When he thinks he's won, when he's made his threats and revealed his plans, that's when you show him how wrong he's been about everything." Thomas nodded solemnly, his young face set with determination that reminded Margaret powerfully of his father. "I'm ready, Mr. Bear. Let's show this man what happens when he hurts our family." As the carriage drew to a stop in front of their house, Margaret felt the weight of the moment settling over them like a gathering storm. Everything they had worked for, everything Thomas had endured, everything Bear had sacrificed, it all came down to the next hour. "Places everyone," Bear said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of command. Walsh disappeared into the kitchen where his recording equipment was hidden, but could capture every word. Foster positioned himself in the study, close enough to intervene if needed, but out of sight. Bear himself moved to the back hallway, where he could observe while remaining concealed. Margaret smoothed her dress and checked Thomas one final time. Her son sat calmly in his chair, the carved walking stick positioned exactly where he could reach it when the moment came. The military medal was tucked safely in his shirt pocket, a talisman of courage for the trial ahead. "Remember," she whispered, To Thomas, no matter what this man says, no matter how he tries to frighten us, you are loved and protected. Mr. Bear won't let anything happen to us. Thomas reached up and squeezed her hand. I know, Mama, and after tonight, everyone will know the truth about what he did. The heavy knock on the front door came precisely at 8 o'clock. Margaret took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and went to face the man who had orchestrated her family's suffering. Harrison Blackwood was exactly what she had expected. A man in his 50s with the soft features and expensive clothes of someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth and intimidation rather than physical confrontation. He was accompanied by a younger man who clearly served as both secretary and bodyguard. Mrs. Whitmore, Blackwood said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I believe this conversation will be beneficial for both of us. Mr. Blackwood. Margaret stepped aside to let them enter, noting how the younger man's eyes immediately catalogued the room's layout and potential exits. Please, come into the parlor. As they settled into chairs, Blackwood choosing the seat that gave him the best view of Thomas, Margaret saw her son transform into the role they had prepared. His shoulders slumped with the defeated posture of someone who had accepted permanent disability, and his hands lay motionless in his lap, as if the simple act of maintaining hope had become too exhausting to sustain. And this must be young Thomas, Blackwood said, his voice carrying false sympathy. My dear boy, I'm so sorry to hear about your unfortunate accident. Such a tragedy when a young life is limited by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Thomas looked up with carefully manufactured despair. Yes, sir. The doctors say I'll never walk again. Indeed, medical science can be quite definitive about such matters. Blackwood's tone suggested that he was stating simple facts rather than commenting on a child's devastating injury. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit tonight. Margaret sat down across from their unwelcome guests, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. You mentioned irregularities in your letter. I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean. Blackwood exchanged a glance with his companion before leaning forward with the confident manner of a man who believed he held all the advantages. Mrs. Whitmore, I've made it my business to understand the financial pressures facing your family, the medical expenses, the home modifications, the ongoing care requirements for your son's condition. His smile became predatory, quite overwhelming for a widow with limited resources. We're managing. Are you? My sources suggest otherwise. In fact, I have reason to believe you might be considering some rather desperate measures to improve your situation. Margaret forced herself to look confused rather than angry. I'm not sure what you're implying. Come now, Mrs. Whitmore, there's no need for pretense between us. I know about the insurance claims, the medical consultations designed to inflate the severity of your son's condition, the carefully orchestrated presentation of a family in desperate need of financial assistance. The accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. Beside her, Thomas maintained his pose of dejected resignation, while she could feel his anger radiating beneath the surface. Mr. Blackwood, my son's condition is exactly what the doctors have diagnosed. I don't understand what you're suggesting. Blackwood's companion reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folder, placing several photographs on the coffee table between them. Margaret recognized the images as surveillance photos of their home, taken from various angles and distances. These photographs document the comings and goings at your residence over the past several weeks, Blackwood said smoothly, including the regular visits from a certain mountain hermit with questionable credentials and methods that no legitimate physician would endorse. Margaret felt her heart hammering, but she forced herself to remain calm. Mr. McKinnon has been helping with repairs around the property. Work my late husband left unfinished. Repairs. Blackwood's laugh was cold. Mrs. Whitmore, we both know that Jeremiah McKinnon is no handyman. The man is a disgraced former army medic who lost his medical privileges after questionable practices. During the war, If he's been treating your son, you're engaging in medical fraud that could result in serious criminal charges." The lie was smoothly delivered and completely believable to anyone who didn't know Bear's true character. Margaret could see how Blackwood intended to use this fabricated scandal to destroy their credibility, while positioning himself as the reasonable businessman offering a solution to their legal troubles. "I'm not sure what you want from us," Margaret said carefully. "What I want is simple. You have land that I need for a legitimate business development. You have financial pressures that my purchase offer could resolve, and you have a son whose future would be much more secure with proper medical care than with whatever quackery this mountain man has been providing." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more calculating. "I'm prepared to offer you 3 times the property's assessed value, immediate payment, and assistance in relocating to a community with better medical facilities for Thomas's ongoing care. In exchange, you simply sign over the deed and agree to never discuss the irregularities in your son's treatment." The offer was delivered with the confidence of a man who believed he had cornered his prey, but Margaret could see in Thomas's barely contained tension that the moment of revelation was approaching. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then I'm afraid I would be compelled to report my concerns about medical fraud to the territorial authorities. Your reputation would be destroyed. Your son would be taken into protective custody while his true condition was assessed by qualified physicians, and you would face criminal charges that could result in imprisonment." The threat hung in the air, like poison designed to crush any resistance through sheer, overwhelming consequences. Blackwood clearly believed he had presented an ultimatum that no reasonable person would refuse. From the hallway came the subtle sound of Bear shifting position, preparing for whatever came next. In the kitchen, Walsh's recording equipment captured every word of Blackwood's extortion attempt. And in his chair, Thomas gathered himself for the performance that would expose the entire conspiracy. "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said quietly, "before I respond to your generous offer, I think there's something you should know about my sons." "A condition?" "Oh, and what might that be?" Margaret looked at Thomas and nodded slightly. "Thomas, would you like to show Mr. Blackwood how you've been doing lately?" For a moment, confusion flickered across Blackwood's features. Then Thomas reached for the carved walking stick, grasped it firmly, and began to rise from his chair. The transformation in the room was electric. Blackwood's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold rage as he realized that his carefully constructed scheme was crumbling before his eyes. Thomas rose from his chair with the careful determination of someone performing a miracle. The carved walking stick provided steady support as he straightened to his full height, and for a moment the parlor was completely silent except for the sound of Blackwood's sharp intake of breath. "That's impossible," Blackwood whispered, his composure cracking as he stared at the boy who was supposed to be permanently paralyzed. "The medical reports. The doctors said I might never walk again," Thomas corrected, his young voice steady and clear. "They never said I wouldn't. And Mr. Bear taught me that sometimes the most important healing happens when nobody thinks it's possible." Margaret watched as her son took his first tentative step, then another. Each movement was deliberate and careful, but unmistakably voluntary. The months of treatment, exercise, and unwavering faith had culminated in this moment. A child defying medical odds and exposing the cruel assumptions of the man who had orchestrated his suffering. Blackwood's companion was on his feet instantly, his hand moving toward the weapon concealed beneath his coat. But before he could draw it, Bear McKinnon emerged from the hallway with his rifle trained on the 2 intruders. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Bear said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced dangerous men many times before. "This conversation is just getting interesting." "You," Blackwood snarled, recognizing Bear as the mountain man whose treatments had destroyed his carefully laid plans. "You've ruined everything." "No, Mr. Blackwood, you ruined everything the day you decided to hurt an innocent child for profit." Bear's rifle never wavered from its target. But Thomas here has been kind enough to provide us with a demonstration of just how wrong your assumptions were. Thomas took another step, then another, making his way slowly but steadily across the parlor. Each footfall seemed to echo with the sound of justice being served, and Margaret felt tears of pride and joy streaming down her face as she watched her son reclaim his mobility. "This proves nothing," Blackwood said, his voice desperate, as he tried to salvage some advantage from the situation. "So the boy has recovered some function. That doesn't change the financial realities facing your family, Mrs. Whitmore. You still need my offer." "Actually," said a new voice from the study doorway, "I don't think she does." Daniel Foster stepped into the parlor, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawyer who had just witnessed a complete confession. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Daniel Foster, Mrs. Whitmore's legal counsel. I've been listening to your very enlightening conversation this evening." Blackwood's face went pale as he realized the trap they had walked into. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine." Foster smiled and gestured toward the kitchen, where Walsh emerged with his recording equipment. "Actually, we have every word you've spoken tonight documented on a new Edison phonograph cylinder. Your threats, your admission of surveillance, your extortion attempt, all of it preserved for presentation to a federal judge." "But more importantly," Bear said, his attention still focused on Blackwood's increasingly agitated companion, "you've just witnessed the complete failure of your scheme. Thomas isn't permanently disabled. Mrs. Whitmore doesn't need your money, and your entire plan was based on false assumptions about what legitimate healing could accomplish." Thomas had reached the center of the parlor now, standing on his own, 2 feet, with only the walking stick for support. The sight of him vertical and mobile seemed to rob Blackwood of his last reserves of arrogance. "How?" Blackwood asked, his voice hollow with defeat. The doctors said what they believed based on conventional knowledge," Margaret replied, moving to stand beside her son. "But they didn't account for the healing power of faith, determination, and treatments that go beyond what medical schools teach." Sheriff Morrison's voice called out from the front porch, "Mrs. Whitmore, everything all right in there?" "Come in, Sheriff," Margaret called back. "I think Mr. Blackwood was just about to explain some things to you." Morrison entered with 2 deputies, their presence filling the parlor with the authority of territorial law. The sheriff took in the scene quickly, Bear with his rifle, Thomas standing triumphantly with his walking stick, and Blackwood and his companion clearly caught in circumstances they couldn't explain away. "Sheriff Morrison," Foster said formally, "I'd like to present evidence of conspiracy, attempted extortion, and assault against a minor." He gestured toward the photographs Blackwood had left on the coffee table. "Mr. Blackwood has been conducting illegal surveillance and has tonight attempted to coerce Mrs. Whitmore into selling her property under threat of fabricated criminal charges." Morrison examined the photographs, his expression growing darker with each image. "Mr. Blackwood, these pictures were taken without permission on private property. That's a territorial offense right there." "Sheriff," Blackwood said, trying to recover some semblance of authority, "there's been a misunderstanding. I came here to make a legitimate business offer. You came here to threaten a widow and her disabled child," Morrison interrupted. "Except the child isn't disabled anymore, is he?" Thomas chose that moment to take several more steps, demonstrating his mobility for the law enforcement officials who would need to document this evidence. The sight of the boy walking, the same child whose accident had generated so much sympathy throughout Cedar Ridge, provided irrefutable proof that Blackwood's assumptions had been completely wrong. "Moreover," Foster continued, withdrawing additional documents from his briefcase, "we have physical evidence that Mr. Blackwood arranged for Thomas's accident to occur. Sheriff Morrison discovered a mechanical device designed to simulate a snake, along with proof that the fence post was deliberately weakened." Blackwood's companion made a sudden movement toward the door, but Walsh was ready for him. The former sergeant moved with practiced efficiency, restraining the man before he could flee. "I think you'll find this gentleman has some interesting things to say about who hired him to create an accident involving an 8-year-old boy," Walsh said grimly. As the deputies moved to restrain both men, Blackwood made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position. "You can't prove I ordered anything," he said. "I never directly instructed anyone to hurt the child." "No," Bear replied quietly, "but you just admitted knowing about the accident in advance and using it to pressure Mrs. Whitmore. That makes you an accessory to assault and conspiracy to commit fraud." Thomas had made his way to the window now, looking out at the carriage that had brought his family's tormentors. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of the adults in the room. The boy who was supposed to remain forever seated was now standing at the window, watching as justice finally arrived for those who had wronged him. "Thomas," Margaret said softly, "how do you feel?" Her son turned from the window, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. "I feel like I could walk all the way to the mountains and back, Mama, but mostly I feel like our family is safe now." Sheriff Morrison secured the last of the evidence, while his deputies prepared to transport Blackwood and his accomplice to the territorial jail. "Mrs. Whitmore, you'll need to come to town tomorrow to give a formal statement, and Thomas, we'll need you to demonstrate your mobility for the territorial judge." "Will they go to prison?" Thomas asked, his young sense of justice demanding appropriate consequences for those who had caused his family so much pain. "For a very long time," Morrison assured him. "What they did to you and your mother, that's serious criminal behavior that territorial courts don't treat lightly." As the law enforcement officials prepared to leave with their prisoners, Blackwood turned back for one final look at the scene of his defeat. Thomas stood tall beside his mother, the carved walking stick a symbol of healing and hope rather than dependency. Bear remained vigilant but relaxed, his rifle lowered but ready, and Margaret held her head high with the dignity of a woman who had faced evil and emerged victorious. "This isn't over," Blackwood said quietly, though his words carried no real threat, just the bitter resentment of a man whose carefully planned cruelty had been exposed and defeated. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied with the wisdom of someone far older than his 8 years. "It's over because I can walk again, and that means you were wrong about everything." As the sound of Blackwood's carriage disappeared into the night, escorted by Sheriff Morrison's deputies, an extraordinary silence settled over the Whitmore household. Thomas remained standing by the window, the carved walking stick steady in his hand, watching the last traces of their ordeal fade into darkness. "Is it really over, Mama?" he asked softly. Margaret moved to stand beside her son, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The simple act of standing together, both of them upright, both of them whole, felt like a miracle she was still learning to believe. "Yes, sweetheart, it's really over." Bear secured his rifle and moved to join them at the window. Walsh and Foster were organizing their equipment and evidence, but their presence had become less urgent now that the immediate danger had passed. "Thomas," Bear said quietly, "do you understand what you accomplished tonight?" The boy turned from the window, his face serious with the weight of the evening's events. "I showed everyone that healing is possible when people said it wasn't. More than that, son. You proved that courage and faith can overcome even deliberate cruelty. What Blackwood did to you was evil, but your response to it was the exact opposite of evil." Walsh approached them, his professional demeanor softened by obvious admiration. "Young man, I've served alongside some of the bravest soldiers in the Territorial Army, and I've never seen anything more courageous than what you did tonight." Thomas stood a little straighter, understanding that he was receiving recognition from men who knew something about courage under fire. "Mr. Bear taught me that healing isn't just about making your body work right. It's about proving that bad people can't win when good people don't give up." Foster closed his briefcase with a satisfied snap. "Mrs. Whitmore, the legal proceedings will take several months, but the evidence we gathered tonight is overwhelming. Blackwood will face federal charges for conspiracy, extortion, and assault. His mining operation will be thoroughly investigated, and any properties he acquired through similar methods will be returned to their rightful owners. "And our land?" Margaret asked. "Is yours completely, with mineral rights that will make you one of the wealthiest families in the territory. Your late husband's geological surveys were remarkably accurate. There's enough silver on your property to fund Thomas's education through the finest universities in the country." Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and disorientation. After months of financial worry and emotional exhaustion, the idea of sudden wealth seemed almost impossible to process. "What happens now?" she asked. Bear exchanged glances with Walsh and Foster before answering. "Now you rebuild your lives without the shadow of Blackwood's threats hanging over you. Thomas continues his recovery. You develop your land responsibly, and your family finds its way back to the happiness that was stolen from you." Thomas had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention of someone far older than his years. Now he spoke up with a question that surprised all the adults in the room. "Mr. Bear, will you stay and help us rebuild?" The question hung in the air with implications that went far beyond simple recovery assistance. Margaret felt her heart skip as she waited for Bear's response, realizing how much her own hopes had become intertwined with the possibility of his permanent presence in their lives. Bear knelt down to Thomas's eye level, his expression gentle but serious. "That depends on whether your mother thinks Cedar Ridge needs a doctor who specializes in cases that other physicians might consider hopeless." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood what Bear was offering. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'd like me to stay, Margaret. Not just to complete Thomas's treatment, but to build something permanent here, a medical practice, a life, a future that includes both of you." Before Margaret could respond, Thomas spoke up with the straightforward honesty that had characterized his entire recovery. "Mama, Mr. Bear loves us, and we love him. Isn't that what families are supposed to be about?" The simple truth of her son's observation cut through all of Margaret's careful emotional defenses. This man had saved her child, exposed the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed their lives, and shown them both what it meant to have faith in seemingly impossible healing. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly what families are supposed to be about." Bear rose to his feet, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then I'd like to ask you formally, Margaret Whitmore, if you would consider allowing Jeremiah McKinnon to court you with honorable intentions. And Thomas, I'd like to ask if you would consider allowing me to be the father you deserve." Thomas's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Yes, and can I keep calling you Mr. Bear, because that's the name that belongs to the man who taught me to walk again." Margaret laughed through her tears, the sound richer and more joyful than any she'd made since Robert's death. "Yes to both questions, though I think we should probably use your proper name for the formal courtship." Walsh cleared his throat diplomatically. "If you folks don't mind, Foster and I should head back to town and start preparing the legal documentation. Sounds like there might be another kind of paperwork to consider in the not-too-distant future." As the lawyer and former sergeant gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Foster paused at the door with one final piece of business. "Mrs. Whitmore, given the circumstances of tonight's events and the evidence of Thomas's remarkable recovery, I think the territorial newspapers are going to be very interested in this story. A family triumphing over deliberate cruelty, a mountain man with healing skills that surpass conventional medicine, and a child's courage in the face of overwhelming odds. That's the kind of story that gives people hope." Margaret looked at Bear, then at Thomas, who was now walking slowly around the parlor with growing confidence. "What do you think? Should we share our story?" Thomas considered the question with the same seriousness he'd shown throughout his recovery. "I think if our story helps other families who are facing hard times, then we should tell it. But the most important part isn't that I can walk again. The most important part is that we didn't give up on each other. Bear nodded his agreement. The healing methods I used aren't secrets that should be hidden. If sharing our experience helps other physicians expand their understanding of what's possible, then Thomas's recovery will have benefits far beyond our family. After Walsh and Foster departed, the three of them stood together in the parlor where so much had transpired. The carved walking stick remained in Thomas's hand, no longer a symbol of hope, but a tool of accomplished mobility. The military medal was safely tucked in his pocket, a reminder of courage rewarded. And on the mantelpiece, Margaret's wedding. Ring from her marriage to Robert sat beside a small wildflower that Bear had picked during one of his early visits, a symbol of the new life growing from the foundation of the old. "Mr. Bear," Thomas said thoughtfully, "when you marry Mama, will you still teach me wood carving?" "Every day, if you want to learn. And Thomas, you can call me Papa Bear once we're officially family." Thomas's grin was radiant. "I'd like that. And Papa Bear, I think tomorrow I'm going to walk all the way to town and back just because I can." Margaret pulled both of them into an embrace, marveling at the solid reality of her son's standing figure and the strong presence of the man who had made it all possible. The broken rocking horse in Thomas's room would remain there as a reminder of dreams deferred, but it would be joined now by new symbols of dreams fulfilled and new dreams yet to be realized. Outside, the mountains where Bear McKinnon had lived, in solitude for 5 years, rose against the star-filled sky, but they no longer represented isolation and grief. Now they stood as guardians over a family reunited, a love story written in the language of healing, and a future as bright and limitless. As the Colorado dawn, 6 months later, on a crisp Christmas morning, Thomas Whitmore ran through the snow behind his family's house, his laughter echoing across the meadow where his accident had once shattered their world. The carved walking stick stood propped by the kitchen door, kept not as a necessity, but as a cherished reminder of the journey that had brought them to this moment of complete joy. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as her son chased their new puppy through the drifts, his legs strong and sure beneath him. The sight never failed to fill her with wonder, though the miracle of his recovery had become their daily reality rather than an impossible dream. "He's going to wear himself out before we even get to church," Bear said, coming up behind her too. Wrap his arms around her waist. The simple gold band on her left finger caught the morning light, not her old wedding ring which now rested in a memory box with Robert's letters, but a new ring that Bear had crafted himself from silver mined, on their own land. "Let him run," Margaret said, leaning back against her husband's broad chest. "After everything he's been through, I never want to tell him to slow down again." Bear chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest in a way that made Margaret feel utterly safe and cherished. "Dr. Henley says he's never seen such complete recovery from a spinal injury. Thomas is going to be in medical textbooks, as long as they get the story right," Margaret replied. "That healing happened because of love, patience, and faith, not just medical technique." Through the window, they watched Thomas attempt to build a snowman, his movements quick and confident. The boy who had spent months confined to a wheelchair now moved with the boundless energy of childhood fully restored. But more than his physical recovery, Thomas had gained something precious from his ordeal, a deep understanding of resilience and the unshakable knowledge that love could overcome any challenge. The front door opened to admit Sheriff Morrison, who had become a regular visitor and dear friend since the night they'd exposed Blackwood's conspiracy. The businessman was now serving a 15-year sentence in territorial prison, his illegal mining operation disbanded, and his victims compensated. "Morning, folks," Morrison said, stamping snow from his boots. "Beautiful Christmas morning. Thomas, looks like he's trying to build the world's largest snowman out there. He told me yesterday that he wants to make one big enough that God can see it from heaven," Margaret said, "so he'll know how grateful we are." Bear squeezed Margaret's shoulders gently. "Speaking of gratitude, I have something for both of you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew 2 small wrapped packages. I know we agreed to keep Christmas simple this year, but these seemed important. Margaret accepted her gift with curiosity, unwrapping it to reveal a small, leather-bound journal, its pages blank and ready for new memories. The cover was embossed with their family name, the McKinnon Family Chronicles. For recording the adventures still to come, Bear explained. Thomas's stories, our experiences building the medical practice, the family we're going to create together. Margaret felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes. It's perfect. Bear's gift to Thomas was a miniature version of the carved walking stick, sized perfectly for a child, but crafted with the same attention to detail as the original. When they called Thomas in to see it, his face lit up with delight. My very own walking stick, but Papa Bear, I don't need it for walking anymore. No, son, but every explorer needs a good walking stick for adventures, and I have a feeling you're going to have many adventures ahead of you. Thomas hugged the small staff to his chest, already imagining the expeditions it would accompany. Can we go exploring in the mountains this spring? I want to see where you used to live. We'll make it our first family expedition, Bear promised. You can show me how far those legs of yours can carry you now. As they prepared for Christmas service at the Cedar Ridge Church, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary transformation their lives had undergone. The financial security from their mineral rights had allowed Bear to establish a proper medical practice in town, specializing in cases that other physicians considered hopeless. Patients traveled from across the territory to consult with the doctor who had achieved the impossible with young Thomas Whitmore. But more than professional success, Bear had found his way back to the human connections that gave his healing work meaning. He and Dr. Henley had formed a partnership that combined conventional medicine with Bear's unconventional but effective techniques. Together, they were training other physicians in the holistic approaches that had restored Thomas's mobility. Thomas himself had become something of a celebrity, though he wore his fame with the humility of someone who understood that his recovery was a gift to be shared rather than a personal achievement to be celebrated. He spoke regularly to other families facing medical challenges, his story providing hope to parents who had been told to accept the impossible. Are you ready for this? Bear asked as they prepared to leave for church, where Thomas would be presenting the Christmas pageant's closing speech about miracles and healing. I'm ready, Thomas replied with confidence that had been earned through months of struggle and triumph. I know exactly what I want to say about Christmas miracles. The church was packed when they arrived, with many faces Margaret recognized as families who had come to Cedar Ridge seeking Bear's medical expertise. The community had embraced their mountain man doctor and his unconventional methods, especially after witnessing the living proof of Thomas's complete recovery. As Thomas stood before the congregation to deliver his speech, Margaret felt her heart swell with pride and gratitude. Her son spoke clearly and confidently about the true meaning of Christmas miracles, not supernatural interventions that required no effort, but the daily miracles that occurred when people refused to give up on each other. The miracle wasn't that I learned to walk again, Thomas said, his young voice carrying clearly through the silent church. The miracle was that my mama never stopped believing I could heal, and that Papa Bear had the courage to try treatments that other doctors thought were impossible, and that our whole community supported us even when they didn't understand what we were doing. Margaret felt Bear's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining as their son continued his speech about faith, family, and the healing power of love. The carved walking stick stood beside Thomas as he spoke, no longer a medical necessity, but a symbol of the journey they had all taken together. So when people ask me about my Christmas miracle, Thomas concluded, I tell them it wasn't one big moment when everything changed. It was 1,000 little moments when the people who loved me decided not to give up, and that's the kind of miracle that anyone can help create. As the congregation rose in spontaneous applause, Margaret looked around the church at the faces of people whose lives had been touched by their story. Some were families still struggling with their own medical challenges, drawing hope from Thomas's example. Others were community members who had learned that healing could take forms that medical textbooks didn't describe. After the service, as they walked home through the snow-covered streets of Cedar Ridge, Thomas ran ahead with his new walking stick, using it to knock icicles from tree branches and test the depth of snowdrifts. Bear and Margaret followed at a more leisurely pace, their hands clasped and their hearts full. "Do you ever miss the mountains?" Margaret asked. "The solitude and simplicity of your old life?" Bear considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss some things about that life. The peace, the connection with nature, the absence of complicated responsibilities. But I wouldn't trade what we have now for all the solitude in the world. Healing others was always my calling, but healing with you and Thomas beside me, that's made the work meaningful in ways I never experienced before." They paused at their front gate, watching as Thomas attempted to balance his new walking stick. On his nose, like a circus performer, the sight of their son's carefree joy, combined with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything, created a moment of perfect gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Bear asked, noticing Margaret's contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about that first night when you came to examine Thomas, and how I was so desperate I would have accepted any possibility of healing, no matter how remote." Margaret smiled at the memory. "I never imagined that what we would find wasn't just healing for Thomas, but healing for all of us." Bear lifted their joined hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "The best healing always works that way. When you fix one broken thing, you often discover that everything else needed fixing too." As they entered their home, Margaret caught sight of the family chronicle that Bear had given her that morning. Tonight, she would make the first entry, recording not just the events of Christmas Day, but the completion of their family's transformation from tragedy to triumph. The broken rocking horse still sat in Thomas's room, but now it was accompanied by shelves full of the wooden animals he carved with Bear's patient instruction. The military medal remained carefully preserved in his diary, though the diary itself was now filled with records of adventures and accomplishments rather than medical symptoms and setbacks. And in the kitchen, the bundle of mountain herbs that had once represented desperate hope now hung alongside dozens of others, part of Bear's growing collection of natural remedies that complemented his conventional medical practice. That evening, as Thomas fell, asleep exhausted from his Christmas adventures, Margaret and Bear sat by the fire, planning the year ahead. There would be challenges, certainly. Bear's medical practice was growing rapidly, bringing both opportunities and responsibilities they were still learning to navigate. Thomas would start attending the regular school again, integrating with children who had never experienced the kind of adversity that had shaped his young character. But for tonight, as snow fell softly outside their windows and their son slept peacefully in his bed, Margaret Whitmore McKinnon allowed herself to feel completely, perfectly happy. The widow, who had once fallen to her knees in despair, had risen to embrace a future brighter than any she had dared imagine. The carved walking stick stood sentinel by Thomas's bedside, no longer needed for support, but treasured as a symbol of the mountain man's first gift to their family, the gift of hope made manifest in wood and faith. Tomorrow would bring new patients to Bear's practice, new adventures for Thomas, and new chapters in the family chronicle Margaret would faithfully maintain. But tonight was for gratitude, for the quiet miracle of a house filled with love, and for the extraordinary ordinary moment of a family made whole through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to surrender to despair. Outside, the mountains that had once been Bear's refuge stood guard over the valley, their peaks touched with starlight and their slopes heavy with snow. They had given up their hermit, but gained something far more precious, the knowledge that even in the wilderness, love could find a way to heal what seemed forever broken. And in the morning, when Thomas would wake and run to the window to see, How much snow had fallen during the night. He would see a world transformed by winter's beauty, just as his family had been transformed by the healing power of hope, determination, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow could always be better than today. The rich widow had indeed fallen to her knees when she watched her child walk, not in despair this time, but in overwhelming gratitude for the mountain man who had taught them all that miracles were not supernatural interventions, but the natural result of love, refusing to accept defeat. Their story would be told for generations in Cedar Ridge, a testament to the truth that healing comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply the refusal to give up on those we love. The carved walking stick would be passed down through their family, generation to generation, carrying with it the memory of the Christmas when a broken boy learned to run again, and a broken family discovered that love could mend anything that courage was brave enough to attempt.